Big man ting lanyap of sorts with Kevin Liverpool, facilitator of Caribbean Male Action Network, or Cariman. And we want to thank you for joining us, Kevin, but we want to start off with an overview of Cariman. What is the network about?
Thank you very much, TK, for having me. Cariman is a regional network of individuals and organizations that work on transforming masculinities and engaging men and boys for gender equality and to end violence against women and girls. We have country chapters across several Caribbean territories, including Trinidad and Tobago, and we really work in collaboration or as allies to the women's movement to ensure that engaging men and boys is not an end in itself, but a vehicle to achieve gender equality.
And I want you to expand on that a little bit, please, because the first conversation that we had with regard to big man things was that looking at the construct of masculinity or Caribbean masculinity, you could not do that in a vacuum. You had to involve the feminine or the divine feminine. So in terms of saying, okay, well, this is not an end unto itself. Take me a little further along that road, thanks.
Sure. So one of the things we recognize and we appreciate at Cariman is that the women's movement has been championing this cause for many years. And it's because women and girls are disproportionately affected by sexism, by the imbalance of power, and by gender equality within society. At Cariman, we do not come in as saviors, as men to save the day, but we work with women, with women's organizations, with feminist organizations as allies to learn from them and to support the work that they are doing to promote gender equality.
And what would you say to the person who says it has to be one or the other? Because it seems as though some people are of the view that in order for one person's cup to be filled, another person's cup has to be emptied. What would you tell that person?
Yeah, so gender equality is not a zero-sum game. It's not it's not black and white as a person in that situation would describe it. But gender equality is good for women, it's good for men, and it's good for all of society.
And we're talking about masculine natures, gendered roles, and masculinity. I want to ask you about your construct, or what you perceive as your construct of masculinity. Thanks, Kevin.
Sure, and that's a huge question, because when we look at the constructs of masculinity, and if we are to personalize it, this has started from the moment that we were born. From the moment that children are born, we usually decide, okay, it's a boy, you're going to get blue clothes. It's a girl, you're going to get pink clothes. And then we begin to associate different behaviors, different roles, different views of how boys ought to behave and girls ought to behave. These views are reinforced by the media and by the millions of messages we receive every day. They are reinforced in our peer groups, growing up as children, and the family, religion, the media, as I mentioned, all play an important part in shaping what it means to be masculine and what it means to be feminine. And within our society, and all societies across the world, as a matter of fact, that is really associated with what is called patriarchal masculinity, or the idea that masculinity is superior to femininity and that men have authority over women.
And that makes me ask the question, or look at the fact that there's this term that has been flying around called toxic masculinity. So how does toxic masculinity enter into the equation?
Yeah, so when people use the term toxic masculinity, what they're referring to is a set of ideas and beliefs and attitudes that really create a power imbalance between men and women, and between men and other men, where masculinity, as I mentioned earlier, where masculinity is seen as superior to femininity. And we see that playing out when we see the high rates of domestic violence, for example, in Trinidad and across the Caribbean.
No, I wonder sometimes, because I remember someone saying that every conversation, every dialogue, there are levels of power at play. And it makes me want to ask the question, just in terms of sharing meaning and understanding what is being said at a point in time. A word as simple as no is looked at in very different ways sometimes. For some, no might mean no, as in negative, please don't. Other times, someone else may be receiving that and saying, okay, well, you're playing hard to get. You want me to be persistent. Right. You want me to show that I really mean what I say. So in terms of like that conversation and that communication, where is it that we fall short, or where is it that we need to try to do better in your view?
Yeah, so this toxic masculinity that you mentioned earlier really emphasizes power over. So it really encourages men to have power over women and power over other men. And what we really try to do at Cariman is move towards a more transformative masculinity, where we have power with or power to, power to achieve different things, such as gender equality, power with others, other men, women, to promote healthy ideals in society. As it relates to consent, it's really important that we teach, especially our boys, the idea of no and no meaning no. Recently, I've had some conversations where I realized that for some people, it's easy to understand that no means no and that yes means yes. There's a challenge for some persons that no could be changed, that a yes consent could be changed to no at any point in time, and no reason needs to be given. And I always see that this is very tricky, especially in intimate settings. And we need to teach our boys and our young men all about consent and promote that culture of consent.
It's interesting, Kevin, because one of the things, though, we're just outside the Christmas season, having passed Lewa, but a song that I really have a problem with is Baby It's Cold Outside, because it's bothering me. Because the person is saying all these things, why, no, negative, and the person just going down that road. And it feels like that is a perfect example of that idea, but it can be almost kind of insidious. And it's so nice. And we have people singing it and playing it.
Yeah. I know what you mean. And when we analyze a lot of the music we listen to, both locally, regionally, and internationally, we get a lot of these mixed messages coming through. So it's important that even though it's enjoyable, it's important on an individual level that we begin to really ask hard questions about the things that we consume and the things that we enjoy. And at an interpersonal level, with the men in our lives, with the boys in our lives, that we take time to sit and deconstruct these messages and really get to the root of what they may mean, because the consequences are far-reaching.
And I want to continue this conversation on the other side of the break. We're speaking with Kevin Liverpool, facilitator for Cariman. Stay with us as we discuss big man things on TTT. Welcome back. We are speaking with Kevin Liverpool, facilitator for Cariman, the Caribbean Male Action Network. We are discussing a lot of things centering around masculinity and what some of these things mean. Now, you spoke about having these conversations and deconstructing messages. Just before we get to that, Kevin, there's a saying that power is derived in cooperation and silence. You also say that Cariman is a network. What are some of the advantages that you find being able to have these linkages across different jurisdictions and territories?
Well, for one, we avoid repeating mistakes, definitely. So there's that value in knowledge management and sharing stories, sharing lessons learned, sharing experiences, because we all work in the same setting, even though the context may be different, and communities will vary when compared to each other, especially when you compare them across countries. We're in the same field. So there's that value to sharing stories and sharing experiences. There's also the value of, because we work in a non-profit environment, the value of resource mobilization and the sharing of resources, not only financial, but also human, and providing that technical support to one another. So together we are much stronger. We avoid working in silos and are able to make a greater impact across the region.
Definitely working that gestalt effect for all it's worth. But
Yeah.
in terms of those conversations, I want to get back to having those conversations. Is it that you're just able to say, okay, well, speak to somebody off the street? Or is it that you need to create a space, be it a safe space, where you can be able to deconstruct some of those messages? What goes into preparing a space or tilling the soil before you have that conversation that will yield positive results, hopefully?
Yeah. So there's no hard or fast rule when it comes to working in different communities. But as you mentioned, what is important is creating a safe space, because at Cariman we believe that most men have learned how to be men in very unhealthy ways, and if we start there, um, what we require from men is that they be vulnerable, that they be honest, that they be open, and begin to explore the different ways that they have learned to be men, the different values that they owe to, and be willing to be stripped bare as they begin to analyze and reflect on all of their views, piece by piece, of course. So it really requires relationship building at the grassroots level, at that community level, but also constant advocacy at institutional levels for better policies that promote gender equality, and constant research as well to support the work that we do.
And in terms of that research, what is some of the feedback that you get when you have someone who has made that time and created that space within themselves to articulate their vulnerability and evolve past it, or at least work with it, and they're in the process of that? What are some of the things that you hear to say, okay, well, this is something we can work on a little more, possibly this is something that we can go forward with on a larger scale, we can scale it up?
Yeah. So I can personalize that. I can share about me, because for me as well, it's a journey. Because we live in a society where just being male gives you that advantage and that privilege, so to speak, because of those patriarchal ideals that masculinity is superior to femininity. You start off in a space of being oblivious. So you don't even know that a problem exists. But then when you realize it and you begin to really look within and reflect upon your own views, it's really an eye-opener. And there are different levels of healing that would be required personally as you go on this journey. But it goes beyond the healing. It requires a level of commitment as well. So, for example, a very personal example, when I discovered the research, when I came across the research that globally women do 4 to 10 times as much housework as men on average. That's one thing to come across that, and that's shocking reality. But what it now means for me as a husband and as a father, it means that I need to go and put in extra time doing dishes, unpaid care work, taking care of children. I need to go in and put in extra time to balance that, so that the burden is not on my wife. So personally, It's about moving from that realization and moving into action. And then moving into encouraging other men within your space to do likewise.
And I really like the fact that you were able to bring it down to that level, down to brass tacks, because many people may say, well, I'm respectful, I leave the toilet seat up, or I leave it down, or I do what I'm supposed to on that level. But in terms of saying, okay, well, this is something, have you ever looked at this, as opposed to saying that I'm not violent? Have you helped like this? And moving from awareness to a level of accountability. Now, you've spoken about being an ally more than once. With that level of awareness, because I'm happy in this series of conversations that we're talking to men about men and what we can do. How can we as men be greater allies?
Right. So the first thing that we encourage men to do is first acknowledge the situation that there is an imbalance of power in society, and that imbalance favors men. So acknowledge that, acknowledge whatever views that and beliefs and attitudes that you may have as a man that sustains that. So it begins that first level of vulnerability and self-reflection. The second thing we encourage men to do is to listen to the stories and the experiences of women. Get honest feedback from women around you, your partner, friends, about their views on us, their impressions of us, and how our words and how our behavior affects them, right? That requires a level of humility, of course. And another thing we encourage men to do is to speak out and to speak up. And wherever you have friends or other men in your space who may be engaging in whether it's behavior or speech that would be hurtful or harmful, speak out, call them out, and hold them accountable for their words and their actions. Let them know that it's not the best thing, that they could probably reconsider the use of their words or change their behavior. And those are like three initial steps that we believe are really important in becoming allies.
And that call for accountability of your friends and peers is something that I wanted to ask about as well. Because many times we might say, well, Kel, I'm not doing it, but at the same time we may be complicit because someone we know, someone in our circle is doing it, and they may be emboldened by our silence while we diminish both ourselves and the target of those comments, jokes, just, well, I say jokes in parenthesis.
So we know that silence is affirming, and at Cariman we say there is a time to call out, but there's also a time to call in. So there's a time to call out where we interrupt and we stop the harmful behavior, but there is a time to call in where we invite persons to have a deeper conversation and reflect on their behavior and begin to problem solve or look for alternative ways to say or to do things.
All right, so Kevin, I really want to thank you for adding to this conversation that needs to be ongoing because it's something that's not going to go away overnight. But Kevin Liverpool, facilitator of Cariman, the Caribbean Male Action Network, and we want to thank you as well on behalf of the entire news team for joining us this evening. Thank you for joining us. Have a good night.